Ray Dalio didn't just build a hedge fund, he built a system, a machine, one that took decades of trial and error, painful failures, and a relentless obsession with refinement. He wrote everything down, he studied history, he systematized his process, and when Bridgewater became the most successful hedge fund in the world, it wasn't just because Ray was brilliant, it was because he turned his fund into something bigger than himself. And that's what we're helping fund managers do every day at Fund Founders. Most people think raising capital is just about pitching a deal. But the fund managers who scale, the ones who attract serious capital and build lasting businesses, do what Ray did. They systematize their strategy. They raise capital legally and confidently, and they build a fund that's designed to outlive them. That's what we do at Fund Founders. We give you the full blueprint to launch, scale, and raise capital for your own investment fund, whether you're just starting out or you've already raised 6 or 7 figures and want to go bigger. We combine the legal documents, investor automations, and fundraising systems into one platform so you can stop guessing and start scaling. Ray Dalio wrote principles. We help you write your own and apply them to your fund today. Get the free fund launch toolkit at wearefundfounders.com/foundations. Again, that's wearefundfounders.com/foundations. Now let's get into the story of the man who systematized success, Ray Dalio. Welcome to Funds on Fire, the podcast that ignites the passion of investment funds and capital raising. Here we turn the complexities of fund management into clear, actionable steps that drive results. I've invested into diverse real estate across the United States and managed thriving funds, and I'm committed to transforming lives through the vehicle of investment funds and helping others to do the same. Join me as we document the journey of scaling businesses, raising capital, and impacting tens of thousands of people around the world. My name is Devin Robinson, and welcome to Funds on Fire. In this episode, we're diving deep into the life and legacy of one of the most influential hedge fund managers of all time, Ray Dalio. In this episode, I want you to expect a blend of financial insight and philosophical reflection. We're going to explore how Dalio built Bridgewater Associates from a spare bedroom startup into the world's largest hedge fund. We're going to examine his investment strategies and big economic calls, relive pivotal moments of success and failure, including the time he lost it all early on. And then we're going to delve into the creation of his famous principles that define Bridgewater's culture. So get comfortable. Join me as we follow Ray Dalio's path from an ordinary kid fascinated by the stock market to a legendary investor and philosopher. This is Fund Founders, the Ray Dalio story. Let's start at the very beginning. Ray Thomas Dalio was born on August 8th, 1949 in the Jackson Heights neighborhood of Queens. He was the only child of a middle-class Italian-American family. His father was a jazz musician, and his mom was a stay-at-home mom. Money was modest in their household, and they weren't poor, but they also weren't wealthy either. Ray often described his upbringing as ordinary and middle class. However, there were two aspects of his childhood that would profoundly shape his future: caddying and curiosity. As a kid, Ray was more street smart than book smart. He admitted he was a mediocre student, a C student, as one profile put it. He was more interested in what was happening outside the classroom than inside it. And that sounds like a lot of us, honestly. That sounds like a lot of really successful entrepreneurs. I know I got C's and D's get degrees. That's what I said. But outside of school, Ray worked at a local golf course on Long Island. He started caddying at the Links Golf Club, which is within walking distance from his home. And I mean, picture the scene: a preteen Ray Dalio carrying golf bags for Wall Street professionals and business titans who came to play. He wasn't just earning tips. He was soaking up conversations about stocks and business, getting glimpses of a world of wealth and capital that was far removed from his own where he lived. And it was on that golf course that Ray made connections that would later prove invaluable. One of the members, named George Lieb, a Wall Street veteran, took a liking to him. I mean, Lieb and his wife would even invite Ray to their house on Park Avenue for family dinners. And more importantly, their son was a trader as well. And through these connections, Ray landed a summer job on the trading floor of a Wall Street firm while he was still in school. Ray was hooked on the markets from that point. In fact, Ray Dalio's investing journey began when he was just 12 years old. Inspired by chatter that he had heard from the golfers, they're just talking while they're playing, Ray took his caddy earnings, which was about $300 at the time, made his first stock purchase. He bought shares in a little airline called Northeast Airlines, and it wasn't exactly a blue chip stock either, but Ray had heard it might merge with a larger company. And sure enough, the merger happened, and his shares tripled right before they went bankrupt. That early win made a huge impression on him. As Ray later recalled, the thrill of that investment success got him hooked on investing. Imagine being 12 years old and tripling your money on a stock tip. You'd probably be hooked too. This was the spark that ignited Ray's lifelong passion for trading and markets. Now, Ray's teenage years fell in the 1960s, a time of societal upheaval and market volatility. By his late teens, he was trading commodity futures in addition to stocks. Commodities had looser borrowing requirements, which he found attractive and leverage wise, and it wasn't all smooth selling though. He had losses and he had wins, but every trade was a lesson. Meanwhile, academically, Dalio wasn't on the fast track to the Ivy League. He managed to get into a local college called C.W. Post College of Long Island University, not because of stellar grades, but perhaps because he could be a good talker. As one writer noted, he scraped by with average grades in his early college years. Interestingly enough, around this time, though, Ray also took up transcendental meditation. This was a practice he had learned at age 19 and that he credits with improving his clarity and stress management. I actually heard him and Tim Ferriss on a podcast talking pretty extensively about how he meditates twice a day and he's done it for years. And it's been pivotal in his life and in the decision-making process that he has. And this mix of meditation and market speculation makes for quite a picture. A young man seeking inner calm in the morning and chasing market action in the afternoon. By the time Ray finished his undergraduate degree in 1971, which he was studying finance, he had pulled his grades up enough to be accepted into Harvard Business School. So in 1973, Ray Dalio graduated with an MBA from Harvard. Just imagine, didn't do well in school before that, found something he loves, graduates with an MBA from Harvard, a prestigious credential that would open doors on Wall Street for him. He was now a well-educated young man with an independent streak, a passion for markets, and a head full of ideas about trading. But as we'll see, Ray's early post-MBA stint in the financial industry did not go entirely according to plan. Fresh out of Harvard at age 24, Ray jumped into a financial world in the early 70s. This was a tumultuous economic time. The U.S. was experiencing stagflation, which essentially is high inflation and low growth. The stock market had crashed in the 1973 and 1974, and the old Bretton Woods currency system had recently collapsed. It was in this environment that Ray Dalio cut his teeth professionally, and it wasn't always pretty. One of his first jobs was at a commodities trading firm, which one source describes as cratering, meaning it was going downhill fast. Being passionate about commodities, and if you remember, he was trading commodity futures as a student, took on a role there, but the firm struggled and he didn't stay long. He then worked as a broker on Wall Street. And here's where an often repeated legend of Ray Dalio emerges. According to Rob Copeland's investigative biography, The Fund, Dalio's exit from that brokerage was rather dramatic. He was fired after clashing with his boss. Reportedly, Dalio punched his supervisor in the face during a dispute. And he even brought a stripper to a work party. Yeah, you heard that right. This is a side of Ray Dalio that you won't find often. Feisty and perhaps even a bit reckless. Dalio hasn't spoken much about this incident publicly. He did write it in his book as well, and Principles, which I read. And some details might be exaggerated in the retelling, but it illustrates an important trait. Ray had a rebellious, rule-breaking streak that I think oftentimes is necessary to reach where he did. He wasn't afraid to defy convention or authority, and a quality that would rather help him innovate in finance, though it could get him into trouble too. Now, by 1975, at just 26 years old, and with those brief job experiences behind him, Ray decided to go out on his own and found Bridgewater. And why do you think he did it? I don't know. Maybe it's because getting fired made him unemployable in the short term on Wall Street. Everyone heard the stories, or perhaps it was his independent entrepreneurial nature simply pushed him to create something of his own. Likely, it was probably a bit of both. He had some savings, a Harvard MBA, and a head full of trading strategies, and more importantly, a handful of connections from his caddying days that believed in him. One of those connections was actually his romantic connection. Ray had recently married Barbara, his colleague's sweetheart, and she wasn't just a regular Barbara. She happened to be from the wealthy Vanderbilt family. Yes, those Vanderbilts. Barbara is a descendant of the legendary Vanderbilt lineage. Through Barbara and other contacts, Ray had access to a network of potential investors with old money that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. As Copeland writes, Dalio's proximity to that world taught him something crucial. Rich institutional investors cared less about shooting the lights out with the huge returns and more about not losing money. In other words, they valued risk management. They really didn't care about making more money. They wanted to retain their wealth. This insight would shape the initial business plan of Bridgewater. Now, so in 1975, operating out of a two-bedroom apartment, Ray Dalio founded Bridgewater Associates. At the start, Bridgewater wasn't exactly the giant hedge fund that it is today. It was more of a boutique consulting and research firm. Ray began by advising corporate clients, particularly in the commodities realm. Commodities were seen as a dull, old school area of finance at the time. Stocks and bonds were the glamorous asset. But Dalio understood that for companies whose business depended on things like grain, oil, and meat prices, hedging those commodities costs would be a matter of survival. Bridgewater would help companies manage risk. For example, if a client relied on a volatile commodity, Ray would suggest investments or hedging strategies in other assets that might offset losses if that commodity's price swung wildly. And Bridgewater's years involves McDonald's. In the late 1970s, McDonald's was raising rising costs for its chicken supplies. Think of all those chicken nuggets, right? According to accounts, Bridgewater advised McDonald's on a creative hedge, buying up soybean futures because soy meal is a key feed for chickens. If chicken prices rose, which hurt McDonald's, it would likely be driven by a higher feed cost. But those same conditions would make McDonald's soy's futures bet profitable, offsetting the pain. This kind of clever commodities driven hedge was Dalio's early specialties. McDonald's was impressed and signed on as a client. With that win, Bridgewater started gaining traction and credibility. And I also read in the book, which is very interesting. I think it was Tyson and McDonald's, and Ray got them two together and helped them to create the chicken nugget. That's crazy. And by the end of the 1970s, Bridgewater's reputation and Ray's global economic insights were growing. Ray was publishing a newsletter called Daily Observations with analysis of microeconomic trends and markets, which circulated among investors. As I was reading this, I thought about this. This was like the first webinar. Him and one of his sales guys would go around the country with a slide, one of those giant slide machines, and pitch people on their daily observations reports every month for $3,000 a month. And they went around the country doing that. He essentially went around doing webinars for his course, which is, cracks me up, but it's for his research report. But it's just crazy to think about his entrepreneur spirit. He was positioning himself not only as a trader, but as a microeconomic thinker. And in those years, the global economy saw seismic events, runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes under Paul Volcker, oil shocks, and debt crisis in developing countries. Dalio was watching it all closely and developing his own framework for understanding the economy, which we'll talk about more later. Bridgewater's client list kept expanding into the early 1980s. They landed big fish. For instance, the World Bank's pension fund and Eastman Kodak's pension fund both hired Bridgewater to manage assets for them. Imagine a 30-something Ray Dalio now managing money for some of the largest pools of capital. It was a huge vote of confidence. In 1981, Ray moved Bridgewater's offices to Westport, Connecticut from where he was living. And I remember him and his best friend did it, and they were living in the barn. He talks about it in the book, like they actually met in his house. The office was in his house. His kids would go to the bathroom with the door open. It was just a really homely feeling. He and Barbara wanted to settle and raise their family there. And so he thought, why not? Things seemed to be going well. Dalio was on the way to carving out a niche as a successful investment advisor and money manager. But if this were a movie, here's where the ominous music might cue in. Ray was about to experience the first major crisis and failure of his career, an event that would nearly destroy Bridgewater and leave a lasting scar on Dalio's psyche, ultimately leading him to develop the very principles and humility that he's known for today. Let's set the stage for that crisis. It's the early 1980s, and Ray Dalio is about to learn a hard lesson on overconfidence. By 1982, Ray Dalio was in his early 30s and, by outward appearance, doing very well. Bridgewater had a growing client base, and Dalio had gained some notoriety for his bold predictions about the economy. And bold he was, perhaps too bold. Ray had developed a habit for forecasting big macro moves, often with a bearish tint. As one journalist talked about, Dalio tended to see doom and recession at every turn. He was deeply studying history and drawing parallels to the present. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the U.S. economy was in an absolute mess. High inflation, slow growth, stagflation. And many feared something like the Great Depression would happen again. Ray was among them. In 1982, a specific catalyst arrived. Mexico defaulted on its foreign debt. This was a big deal. It threatened to kick off an international debt crisis, potentially toppling U.S. banks that had lit heavily to Latin America. Dalio saw this as the domino that would trigger a broader economic catastrophe. He became convinced that the U.S. was headed for a deep recession, maybe even a depression, due to the burden of the debt and high interest rates. He was so confident in his view that he didn't just whisper it to clients, he shouted it from rooftops. That summer, Congress held hearings on the economic outlook in light of the Mexico crisis. Ray Dalio was invited to testify. This is a sign that his reputation as a young economic sage had grown. In front of the congressional committee, Dalio delivered a dire warning. He said, "The enormity of our debt implies that the depression will be as bad or worse than that witnessed in the 1930s. One congressman commented that Dalio's testimony was more grim than the ghost of Hamlet's father, a poetic way of saying that this guy was really pessimistic. Dalio also appeared on the popular TV show Wall Street Week with Louis Rukeyser to spread the forecast of gloom. Back at Bridgewater, he positioned investments for this downturn, presumably taking defensive positions that would profit if markets fell and economies contracted. And then the exact opposite happened. The Federal Reserve under Chairman Volcker dramatically shifted policy in late 1982. They started loosening interest rates after years of tight monetary policy. This move reliquefied the bank system, and combined with other factors, it ignited a surge of economic activity. The stock market took off like a rocket. 1982 marked the start of a long 1980s bull market, and the economy rebounded instead of crashing. In short, Ray's prediction was dead wrong. The depression he foresaw never arrived. Instead, recovery did. For Bridgewater and Dalio, the result was devastating. They had bet on the wrong outcome and lost money for clients. Bridgewater's business dried up as clients withdrew. By 1983, the once growing firm was reduced to essentially one employee. He had to lay off everybody, even his business partner. He had to let him go, and his business partner moved right back all to Oklahoma, across the country. So there was just one employee left, Ray. He had laid off everyone. Dalio later wrote, Bridgewater, which had been a growing firm, was down to one employee, its founder. Even more humiliating, Ray Dalio went broke. He talked about how he had to borrow $4,000 from his dad just to pay his personal bills and keep his family afloat while they tried to sell their second car. Imagine that, a Harvard MBA, former market wonder kid, reduced to asking your dad to help pay rent. Ray called this period his abyss, the lowest point of his life. Years later, Dalio reflected on his painful failure with stark honesty. He said, I saw that I was being an arrogant jerk who was totally confident in a totally incorrect view, and I'm still shocked and embarrassed by how arrogant I was. Those are Ray's own words written in his book, Principles. It takes a lot for anyone, let alone a successful investor, to admit, I was an arrogant jerk. But this moment humbled him profoundly. It was a turning point, one that Ray Dalio says was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it forced him to change how he thought. As he told one interviewer, losing his bet was like a blow to my head with a baseball bat. I went broke. This was very, very painful. Yet, he came to see it as a priceless education rather than a permanent defeat. In the ashes of failure, Ray embarked on a period of deep reflection. He asked himself, how could I have been so certain and so wrong? How do I make sure I never miscalculate like this again? The lessons he learned in that crucible would form the foundations of his future success. Dalio identified 3 key changes he needed to make in his approach from then on. 1, embrace thoughtful disagreement. He realized that anytime he is certain of something, he should remember he could be wrong. Going forward, Ray vowed to seek out smart people who disagreed with him and have open, honest debate. By hearing opposing views, he'd reduce the chance of being blinded by his own bias. In his words, whenever I'm making a decision in the markets, I never know if I'm right. That taught me a fear of being wrong, and the value of independent thinking and thoughtful disagreement to raise my probabilities of being right. The next was to improve risk management through diversification. Ray recognized that he had bet too heavily on one outcome. To survive future unknowns, he needed better diversification. He started developing ways to balance risks so that no single bet could take him down. He later formalized this into what he calls the holy grail of investing, which is finding 15 or more good or uncorrelated bets. According to Dalio, with about 15 uncorrelated streams of return, I won't lower my return, but I will lower my risk by up to 80%. This insight laid the groundwork for some of Bridgewater's famous strategies, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, which is risk parity and the all-weather fund. The third thing he learned was to study history deeper, expand perspective. Dalio also admitted that he was caught off guard by something outside of his life experience. He said, I needed to understand things that never happened in my lifetime better. Just because it hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it hasn't happened before. In practice, this meant that he would go back and study many more historical economic crises and market environments, some from a century ago, to broaden his perspective. This eventually led to him researching hundreds of years of economic history, resulting in frameworks that would fill books later, like his Principles for a Changing New World Order. And then he's even writing a new book right now. And in short, 1982 taught Ray Dalio humility. It changed him from a cocky hotshot to a more open-minded strategist. He almost gave up on Bridgewater at that time. After all, he had a wife and young children to support, and it's tempting to take a steady job for security, especially when you lose all of your money, all of your investors' money, and all of your employees. But Ray had never imagined doing anything else. I just knew I loved the game of investing, he said. He also felt a responsibility to the handful of clients who stuck with him through that debacle. So he soldiered on from his kitchen table, effectively starting Bridgewater all over again in 1983. Only now he was armed with painful wisdom. Dalio has since philosophized that pain plus reflection equals progress. A simple formula: pain plus reflection equals progress. He felt a lot of pain. He did a lot of reflection, and indeed, he made great progress. This theme of learning from mistakes became a bedrock of his philosophy. There's a thin line between experience and pain and growing from it. He has said, make the most out of your mistakes. And he certainly did. Our story could easily have ended up in 1982 with Ray Dalio as a failed nobody, but instead, the Ray Dalio of the late 1980s was a changed man, on a mission to build something better and more resilient. Now, let's enter into the act 2 of this story, the rebuilding of Bridgewater, the formulation of new strategies, and the gradual ascent to hedge fund superstardom. Imagine Ray Dalio in 1983, a humbled trader in his mid-30s, no longer surrounded by a team, just him and maybe an assistant grinding away in a Westport, Connecticut office. Many would have quit after such a catastrophic failure, but Ray treated the aftermath as a learning laboratory. He started trading again, small at first, rigorously applying the lessons of 1982. One of the first things he did was implement those diversification ideas. He began constructing systematic trading rules, essentially algorithms on paper. This was before today's computers, and which are common in finance, but he didn't have that. That would guide Bridgewater's investments. He studied historical data, trying to distill the cause and effect relationships that govern markets. Out of this process came a set of if-then decision rules. If inflation does X, then do Y. If interest rates do A, expect asset B to react with C. Dalio was effectively encoding his economic knowledge into a repeatable process. This systematic approach was unusual at the time. Many traders still followed gut instinct or the so-called tape reading of price. Ray's research-driven, systemized strategy gave Bridgewater an unquestionable edge. Bridgewater also embraced hedging in the pure sense, taking offsetting positions to reduce risk. Dalio ensured that for every bet in one direction, he had another bet or asset that could perform if the world went the other way. Essentially, Bridgewater's portfolios would go long on some assets and short on others, aiming to profit from the relative move rather than an absolute bet on market direction. In fact, the term hedge fund comes from the idea of hedging bets. And while hedge funds in general have fallen out of favor in the 1970s, Dalio was resurrecting and refining the concept. By the mid 1980s, these efforts started to pay off. Bridgewater slowly rebuilt its clientele and its track record. Ray also continued publishing research that drew attention. Even though he had been very wrong in 1982, investors noticed that Bridgewater's actual investment performance post 1982 was stabilizing and improving, often more reliable than Ray's media proclamations, interestingly enough. I mean, there were even notes that even Ray Dalio's public predictions were overly bearish. Bridgewater's trading system didn't necessarily follow those bad calls to the letter, which helped the firm perform pretty decently. A significant milestone came in 1985. Bridgewater authored a detailed report called Inflation and Depression: How Could It Happen Here?, which they sent to their clients. This research caught the eye of the World Bank's Treasury Department, which was responsible for managing the World Bank's pension money. Impressed by Bridgewater's analysis, the World Bank gave Dalio firm a sizable mandate to manage some of their funds. I think it was about $5 million at the time. This was a big leap. Managing money for a prestigious global institution put Bridgewater on the map in a new way. By the late 1980s, Bridgewater had grown steadily. Dalio stayed paranoid and careful. Always remember 1982. He diversified strategies and the instruments that he used, trading not just commodities in U.S. stocks and bonds, but also global currencies, foreign bonds, emerging markets, and all the rest of them. The firm was essentially a global macro hedge fund by this point, trying to find opportunities in over 100 markets worldwide. And thanks to Ray's now intense study of history, Bridgewater was alert to patterns that often might be missed. For example, Dalio studied the Great 1929 crash and Great Depression in depth, which later helped him recognize parallels during the 2008 crisis. During the late 80s, he also observed Japan's roaring stock real estate bubble, the Soviet Union's collapse, and other major shifts, all data points for his evolving model of how the economic machine works, which is a phrase that he started to use in his framework and became really popular over time. One of Bridgewater's early success stories in the comeback era was how they navigated the 1987 stock market crash, the infamous Black Monday in October of 1987. While many investors were caught off guard by the sudden 22% one-day plunge in the Dow, Bridgewater's balanced approach helped cushion the blow. It wasn't that Ray predicted the crash exactly, which few people did, but his risk-conscious portfolio wasn't as exposed to equities, and any losses in stocks were mitigated by gains in bonds since interest rates fell sharply during the panic. This vindicated his emphasis on risk balancing. In 1989 to 1990, Japan's bubble burst. Bridgewater had been warning clients about unsustainable Japanese asset prices, and when the crash came, they were positioned to take advantage of it in some of their strategies. Bit by bit, the firm built a track record for strong performance in various market environments. By 1990, Ray Dalio had accomplished a rare feat. He had come back from failure and made Bridgewater larger than it was before. The firm had a team of talented investment professionals, many of whom Dalio recruited straight from college and trained in Bridgewater's unique way of thinking. He was managing money for pension funds, endowments, and even some governments. Ray was no longer alone. He had partners and lieutenants. Notably, around this time, he hired Bob Prince and later Greg Jensen, who would both eventually rise to co-chief investment officer roles. Bridgewater's culture was forming as well, and we'll talk about that more. Intense debate, analytical rigor, and yes, Ray's demanding personality setting the tone. Before we move to the next phase, it's really worthy of highlighting one particular innovation Ray introduced in the early 1990s, and in 1991, he created a product within Bridgewater called Pure Alpha. Up to then, Bridgewater managed money in somewhat conservative styles, aiming for steady returns and low risk for clients. But Dalio had huge ambitions, as you can imagine. Pure Alpha was conceived as a flagship hedge fund strategy aiming for absolute returns, which is what Alpha is. Essentially all the juice, as he put it. The ideal was that Bridgewater would run an aggressive strategy, making only high conviction active trades, which is the alpha, separate from the normal market returns, which is the beta. Investors who wanted to beat the market could allocate to pure alpha, while those who wanted stable beta returns could invest in the other strategies that he had. Pure alpha turned out to be a game changer. Throughout the 1990s, pure alpha performed spectacularly well, with asset under management roughly doubling every single year during that decade. By taking long and short positions across stocks, bonds, currencies, and commodities, and by keeping those positions systematically balanced, Bridgewater could make money in both up and down markets. For example, when the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, 2001, collapsing tech stocks and throwing the US into recession, Bridgewater's pure alpha flourished. They had seen that bubble for what it was, unsustainable, and avoiding the frenzy, focusing on other opportunities. As a result, while many investors got absolutely crushed after 2000, Bridgewater's funds were largely unscathed by the dot-com bust. In fact, by 2003, Ray Dalio finally appeared on Institutional Investors' Rich List, which is a ranking of a top hedge fund earners, with an estimated personal earning of $111 million that year during the dot-com bust. The once broke guy borrowing $4,000 from his dad had officially become a centimillionaire. More importantly to him, Bridgewater had become known as a top-tier hedge fund. So by the early 2000s, Ray Dalio was sitting near the top of the hedge fund world, albeit still somewhat under the radar compared to flashier Wall Street personalities. Bridgewater was managing billions and growing fast, powered by a proprietary macro engine that seemed to churn out profits regardless of the market direction. But Ray wasn't one to take a break or rest on his laurels. In fact, success triggered in him like a new concern. What happens if I get hit by a bus? Or more mundanely, how will Bridgewater thrive without me someday? This brings us to the next evolution of Ray's journey, the crystallization of his philosophy in the form of written principles and the forging of Bridgewater's famously unconventional corporate culture that he catches a good amount of flack for. Now, after surviving one near-death experience, Dalio became almost obsessed with identifying problems and fixing them systematically. This applied not only to markets, but to management and life. As Bridgewater expanded in the 1990s, Ray eventually realized that managing people can be as tricky as managing markets, and honestly, probably way more. And he wasn't always great at it. In 1993, about a decade after rebuilding, he got a wake-up call from his team that was honestly as bracing in its own way as the 1982 crash for him. Here's what happened. By 1993, Bridgewater had several dozen employees, and Ray, being Ray, was pushing them really hard. He believed in radical honesty, saying exactly what he thought about someone's work, even if it hurt their feelings. He thought everyone knew it was in service of excellence. But one day, 3 senior employees sat him down and gave him a blunt memo. They told Ray that while he was bright and innovative, which is great, he also sometimes says or does things to employees which make them feel incompetent, unnecessary, humiliated, overwhelmed, belittled, oppressed, or otherwise just bad. In short, his tough love approach was backfiring. People were miserable. If you don't learn to manage people better, they warned, the future success of the business will be in jeopardy. Dalio describes reading that memo as, oh my gosh, type of moment. That hurt and surprised me. I never imagined I was having that effect. These people were my extended family. Why didn't they tell me directly? Which is something he wrote. He was at a cultural crossroads. Should Bridgewater tone down the frankness to keep people happy or double down on honesty at the expense of comfort? This was like a mini abyss for Ray. Echoing the earlier one in 1982, he had to choose between high returns and acceptable risk in 1993. Now he had to choose between truth-telling and harmonious relationships. After thinking deeply, though, Ray concluded that he wanted both high standards and a good environment. And the way to achieve that was to explicitly agree on how people should treat each other at Bridgewater. In other words, make the implicit culture explicit. So what did he do? He began writing down his principles, which we often know because of his book Principles. He literally started drafting a set of rules or guidelines, answers to questions like, do we want total transparency or not? How should we handle disagreements? What kind of relationships do we want here? By articulating these, everyone could be on the same page about the rules of the game. Dalio believed this unusual exercise, formalizing the culture in writing, would be the key to our success. It would allow Bridgewater to have thoughtful disagreement without making each other upset. It would be fairly objective and to pursue excellence without people feeling bad unnecessarily. This was the genesis of Dalio's now famous principles. Initially, around the mid 1990s, it was an internal document, a list of around 277 principles in early form. Over the years, Ray kept editing, adding, refining these points. They range from high level values to very nitty gritty management rules, and they came with a lot of Dalioisms, sometimes quirky jargon. For example, employees were encouraged to be radically straightforward and not talk behind people's back. Someone who gossiped was labeled a slimy weasel. Those who brought up problems without proposing solutions were chirpers, like birds chirping uselessly. Great leaders were termed shapers, defined vaguely as visionaries who can execute. Dalio often bestowed these labels on those who spent a lot of time hashing out ideas with him. I actually like this part of the book because he talked about Steve Jobs being a shaper, Bill Gates being a shaper, these people who really pushed, visionaries who pushed the next level to execute at a high level. I really found that as useful. If you weren't a good fit for the role, your box, which is what they called it, and it was like your role, you might lose it. Then you'd either find a new role, which is get to the other side, or get sorted out, which is fired. The language was unique and frankly a bit cultish sounding to outsiders. Inside Bridgewater, though, these principles gradually created a shared vocabulary and ethos. By insisting on absolute transparency, Dalio set up the practices that are astonishing. For instance, Bridgewater began recording almost every meeting and call except the most sensitive clients or personnel discussions and archiving those tapes for anyone in the company to review. This was to ensure nothing went into secret whisper networks. Employees were expected to criticize each other openly and document issues in a company-wide issue log. In fact, managers had quotas for how many issues their team had to log each week, which led to reports on everything from serious investment areas to trivial complaints like the peas in the cafeteria salad bar are wilted. Yes, that was an actual logged issue one time. The idea was to surface all problems, big or small, under the mantra that no problem is too minor to be addressed if it stands in the way of perfection. I mean, as much feedback data as this is, Bridgewater built tools. One legendary tool called the Dot Collector, which was an app, literally an app. People would walk around with one. They on like an iPad, they would walk around with principles, all of the principles, and they would walk around with a Dot Collector. It was an app used in meetings where people rate each other's contributions and attributes, like conceptual thinking or assertiveness, in real time via dots on a screen. By the end of the meeting, you have a colorful display of everyone's feedback for everyone. This feeds into employees' baseball cards, which is metaphorical cards that list each other's personal stats, strengths, and weaknesses as measured over time. I mean, really, they had these. They called them baseball cards. The goal was an idea meritocracy. Decisions weren't going to be made democratically, one person, one vote, but neither autocratically by Dalio alone, rather by giving more weight to people with proven believability on a topic. So if, say, the topic was currency trading and two veterans with great track records strongly disagreed with Ray's views, the system might favor their view unless Ray could persuade others. It's a fascinating attempt to take bias and hierarchy out of decision-making and let the best ideas win, even if the boss disagrees. But in practice, of course, Ray Dalio was still the boss and a force of nature. Not everyone thrived in this pressure cooker. And not everyone thrived in this pressure cooker, as you can imagine. There were incidents where this culture arguably went too far. In Copeland's book, it recounts that Dalio would at times hold what felt like public trials of employees accused of mistakes, interrogating them harshly in front of others. One story describes a famous, really tough executive nicknamed the Ice Queen for her steely composure and how tough she was, being berated by Dalio until she broke down sobbing, animalistic sobbing, as Copeland wrote. These sessions were often recorded and added to the transparency library, an internal Netflix of Bridgewater meetings that all employees were required to watch, both to learn and to reinforce cultural norms. Unsurprisingly, some outsiders and some ex employees have labeled Bridgewater's culture toxic or cult like. The New Yorker noted that the relentless criticism at Bridgewater blurred the line between meaningful issues and petty grievances, creating an atmosphere of near constant complaint. One former employee described it as a surveillance and fear, given all meetings were taped and any comment could become an issue log entry. I mean, there was even a time where a really high profile incident happened in 2016 where a sexual harassment complaint within Bridgewater became public. And the New York Times reported on it, and they reported the firm's handling of it under its radical transparency regime made the accuser feel pressured and exposed publicly. Bridgewater disputed how the story was portrayed, but the episode cast a harsh light on how an ultra transparent culture might fail to protect people in sensitive situations. Ray Dalio has always been defensive yet proud of Bridgewater's culture. He argues that it's not a cult, but a community united by truth seeking. It's not just a paycheck, it's a mission to get better. He would say, and many employees, especially those who survive and rise, swear by the principles and cherish the environment. Dalio himself believes that the proof is in the pudding. Bridgewater's success over decades, he says, is largely due to this very culture. And honestly, as a business owner and as a person who understands this, uh, I I mean, he's right. By surfacing mistakes and differences quickly, they solve problems faster and make better decisions. As he put it, knowing how to have an idea meritocracy is invaluable. We went through tough experiences and got through it well because we have the system. He's pointed out that when Bridgewater underwent a management transition crisis in 2016, which we'll talk about a little bit more, their culture allowed them to hash out disagreements and come to a resolution that kept the firm intact. The media portrayed it sensationally, like a drama. Dalio said, but they missed how well our idea meritocratic system worked to resolve it. So by the late 2000s, Ray Dalio had not only a thriving hedge fund, but also a codified life philosophy in the form of these principles. He started sharing them outside the firm as well. And in 2010, he compiled a 100+ page PDF called Principles and made it public online. It circulated wildly on the internet among entrepreneurs and investors. Millions of people downloaded it. People were fascinated by this peek into Bridgewater's secret sauce. Eventually, he decided to turn it into his book. But before we get into Ray as the author, we need to talk about one more huge chapter: Bridgewater in the global financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. This was Ray Dalio's second chance after 1982 to shine during an economic cataclysm, and this time he nailed it. In the mid 2000s, while Ray was formalizing culture externally, he was becoming something of a macro oracle. His study of debt cycles and economic history had convinced him that the world was building toward another debt crisis. By 2007, the signs were clear to him. Housing prices were unsustainably high, consumers in Wall Street were over-leveraged with debt, and banks had a lot of hidden risk. Think subprime mortgages and complex derivatives. Dalio later explained that he saw parallels between the 2000s credit bubble and the roaring 20s that preceded the 1929 crash. Now, Bridgewater began positioning accordingly, likely buying safe treasury bonds and T-bills and shorting risky credit assets, among other moves. And when the 2008 financial crisis hit, with Lehman Brothers collapsing and markets in free fall, Bridgewater's funds emerged as big winners. Pure Alpha especially rewarded investors in 2008 with a gain of 9.4% in a year when the S&P 500 lost 37%. Think about that. While the average investor saw their portfolio cut by a third, Bridgewater's main fund was up nearly double digits. That is astounding performance. Ray Dalio's long study of how the economic machine works had paid off. He correctly anticipated that a massive deleveraging was needed, meaning everyone would be forced to reduce debt, causing asset prices to plunge, and central banks would respond by printing money and cutting rates to nearly zero, which makes bonds and prices soar. Bridgewater navigated this expertly. And I just think of just as I think through this story, I personally think of like an idea that I live by: hone your craft in obscurity. Now, people were watching him, but in the times when he didn't need it, he practiced, he learned, he got all the information he need so that when it mattered the most, when he's managing tens of billions of dollars, he nails it. And in fact, Bridgewater did so well in early 2008, months before the worst of the crisis. Barron's ran a story dubbing Bridgewater the safest hedge fund because of how they were positioned. In an anecdote, the U.S. Treasury invited Ray Dalio in 2008 to brief them on what was happening. His guidance was sought by policymakers, given his grasp of historical crisis. Ray had studied the 1930s Great Depression playbook, which basically involves central banks ensuring liquidity and governments creating stimulus. Exactly what happened in 2008 and 2009. Dalio later compiled all this knowledge in another book called Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crisis, which he published in 2018, dissecting the 2008 meltdown alongside the other debt crisis in history. One big takeaway from that work: debt cycles are normal and manageable if dealt with early. But if debt is in foreign currency or unchecked, things get ugly. A lesson he emphasized to countries. For Bridgewater, the 2008 win was transformative. They became, by many measures, the largest hedge fund in the world around that time, if not earlier. By 2011, Bridgewater was managing roughly $120 billion for clients, an astonishing number in the hedge fund world. And Dalio personally became a billionaire as his ownership stake in the firm and performance fees piled up. In 2011, Time magazine named Ray Dalio one of the 100 most influential people in the world. This one reclusive fund manager was now stepping onto the global stage. Interestingly, Ray's public profile also grew through an unlikely avenue. A 2011 article in the New Yorker titled Mastering the Machine. It was one of the first in-depth media profiles of Bridgewater, and it painted Dalio as the eccentric philosopher king of Westport with Zen practices. He still meditated twice a day and a fiercely analytical mind. The article divulged a lot of Bridgewater's culture, the tapes, the extreme honesty. Some people on Wall Street were shocked. They were probably thinking, is this place for real? But others were intrigued. Dalio didn't shy from the spotlight either after that. He began speaking more at conferences and writing public essays. One catchphrase that caught on was when Ray declared cash is trash in early 2020. Now, this encouraged investors not to sit on cash, but to invest in balanced portfolios due to low interest rates. Another memorable Dalioism is, if you don't own gold, you know neither history nor economics. He said this in 2011 when he was bullish on gold as a hedge against currency debasement. That line made headlines, showcasing his penchant for tying historical insights, gold's role in past crises, with market views. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is, he says, "He who lives by the crystal ball eats a lot of glass." After 2008, Ray Dalio also turned more of his attention to sharing knowledge. He had all these principles and macro frameworks, and he started to feel a sense of responsibility to pass them on. He has often said that he thinks in terms of legacy, not monetary legacy, but intellectual legacy. So around 2010, Ray embarked on writing a comprehensive version of Principles, Life and Work and Principles Combined, as a book. At the same time, Bridgewater was facing an internal challenge: succession. By 2010, Ray was about 60 years old, and he had once told his team that he aimed to step back in 10 years. Indeed, the firm began a drawn-out process to transfer management control. Ray appointed two co-CEOs, Eileen Murray, one of Bridgewater's top ops executives, and also had his two co-CIOs, Prince and Jensen, handling investments. But as you might guess, given Bridgewater's intensity, succession wasn't smooth. There were power struggles and miscommunication, and in 2016, it came to a head. One co-CEO, Greg Jensen, who wore two hats as co-CEO and co-CIO, was clashing a bit with others. Ultimately, Bridgewater announced Jensen would step down from the CEO role and just focus on investments, leaving Eileen and later McCormick solely in charge. The Wall Street Journal got wind of this and wrote an article painting it as an internal turmoil, implying Ray couldn't let go and there was drama at the top. Dalio bristled at the media's portrayal, insisting that actually this was an example of the principles in action. The team had a rigorous discussion, confronted the issue head on, and came to a meritocratic, decision that Jensen's stepping aside was best. No grudges, just what's best for the firm. That's how Ray frames it. He even compared the media buzz to the hysteria around PIMCO's messy leadership change when Bill Gross left and said they totally misinterpreted Bridgewater's situation. Regardless, the episode showed how challenging it is to transition from a founder driven culture. By 2017, Dalio took a major step. He published his book's Principles, Life and Works. It became a New York Times bestseller and turned Ray into something of a mainstream self-help guru, not just a finance guy. The book was part memoir recounting stories like the 1982 crash and the 1993 memo, and part manual of his principles. Some key tenets from Principles included embrace reality and deal with it, face the harsh truths rather than denying them. And I loved reading this book a couple of times. He also said pain plus reflection equals progress. And we mentioned this, learn from mistakes. Radical truth and radical transparency. Be extremely open and honest. Don't let your ego or blind spots stand in your way. Cultivate humility and open-mindedness. An ideal meritocracy with believability, weighted decision making. That mouthful basically describes the dot collector process that we talked about. Truth and radical truth. It even includes lines like, if you have a problem with someone, don't talk behind their back. Either take it to them or to someone who can fix it. And quirky ones like, don't pick your battles, fight them all. Meaning every issue that stands in the way of your goal should be resolved. And I love this book. I think it's fantastic. I've read it a couple times. To many readers, Principles was eye-opening. To some, it was controversial. A Fortune article asked if Ray was the Steve Jobs of investing or a total nut. But Dalio wasn't done writing. In 2018, as mentioned earlier, he released Big Debt Crisis, a hefty 3-part volume distilling 48 historical debt crisis case studies, essentially offering it for free as a PDF to policymakers and investors as a guide to what to do and what not to do when the next big crisis comes. This was timely since global debt was climbing again, and indeed, COVID crisis of 2020 would test many governments' understanding of these principles. Then in 2020 and 2021, Ray turned his attention to an even grander historical subject, the rise and falls of empire. He published Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Orders, Why Nations Succeed and Fall in 2021. I think this is a fantastic book. In this book, Ray analyzes the last 500 years of histories from the Dutch and British empires to the American post-World War II order and the rising Chinese power to argue that we are in the midst of a significant world order shift. I mean, like, I look at this and you can look at the graphs and see we are in the midst of it, and it rings true right now. It's kind of crazy. Some of his observations are empires and their currencies follow cycles of birth, flourish, and decline. The U.S. is in the late stage of its cycle with high debt, internal conflict, and a rising rival, China. China, he argues, is ascendant and likely to challenge U.S. dominance economically and militarily, much like when the U.S. surpassed Britain. He quantifies power across metrics, which is like education, innovation, military, trade, and shows China catching up in many of these areas. Importantly, he notes 3 big forces shaping the world now: huge debts and money printing, check; big wealth gaps and internal conflicts, populism and polarization, check; and the rise of great power, China, check, to challenge the existing one. The last time we saw something like this happen was in the 1930s, 40s, which was the Depression, class conflict, and then World War II. Ray doesn't predict exact outcomes, but warns of the risk of civil unrest and international war if these conflicts aren't managed. He's even assigned probabilities to scenarios. Like, he gave roughly a 30% chance of civil war in the US by the 2030s if current trends continue, which is a rather stark claim, but like, think about it. I could kind of see it. This changing world order work got a lot of attention. It solidified Dalio's image not just as an investor, but as a global thought leader on economic history and policy. Some critics said he was too soft on China's authoritarian aspects when discussing its rise. And indeed, Dalio has significant investments in China and personal admiration for aspects of its governance, which he's been open about. For example, in 2021, CNBC interviewed, when asked about China's human rights issues, he made an awkward analogy about being like a strict parent, which drew backlash. Dalio later clarified he didn't mean to downplay concerns, but It showed the tightrope he walks as both a cinephile, investor, and an American public figure. Now, before concluding Ray's personal arc and story, let's touch on the final transition. In October 2022, Ray Dalio finally did what he promised. He stepped down from his last remaining control position at Bridgewater. He gave up his board seat and transferred his voting rights to the board. In effect, he handed over control of Bridgewater to the next generation. And led by CEOs Nir Bardia and Mark Bertolini and investment chief Prince Jensen and newer co-CIO, Ray remains connected as a mentor and remains invested in the funds, but Bridgewater is no longer Ray's firm day to day. This was a momentous moment and an end of an era in hedge funds. In Dalio's own words on stepping aside, hopefully until I die, I'll continue to be a mentor, an investor, and board member at Bridgewater because I and they love doing those things together. He made clear he wasn't disappearing. He wasn't just letting go of control. Notably, he said he didn't want Bridgewater to depend on him or his personality. Don't remember me, remember the principles. He often urges. For Ray, ideas and principles are greater than the individual. He seems almost uncomfortable with the idea of legacy as a person. In one interview, when asked if he'd want to be remembered as a great investor or a philosopher, he replied, I really don't like the being remembered thing. Don't remember the person, remember the principles. No story of Ray Dalio is complete, though, without looking at the personal side. His family and values beyond the office. Ray and his wife Barbara have been married since 1976, approaching 50 years together. Barbara is often described as a grounding force, more reserved, very philanthropic, and of course, from a prominent family, which may have opened doors for him early on. Then he's got 4 sons, Devin, which I think is a fantastic name, which, yeah, if reading the book, I thought this was hilarious. He named it out of like one of the best breed of cattle that there is because he was so into commodities. Paul, Matthew, which also calls Matt, and Mark. Ray has written that one of the reasons he wrote down his principles was for his kids, so they could understand his decision making and perhaps apply the lessons to their own lives and challenges. The Dalio family is known for being close-knit. Matt Dalio, one of Ray's middle sons, wrote a touching public note about his father on LinkedIn, giving us insight into Ray as a dad, an individual. He's wildly intelligent, magnificently charming, and brilliant at his best, Matt wrote. But he can also be so rational that it's frustrating. He's bullheaded and blunt. He'll make the same point over and over and over until he's drilled you into submission. That probably sounds familiar. It's basically Ray at work too. Matt pointed out that Ray is an Enneagram type A, the challenger personality, decisive, strong-willed, wanting control, and which can clash with more sensitive types, which I think is cool because I'm a 7, wing 8. I tend to go to that side as well. This matches what we've seen. People who thrive with Ray often appreciate his strength and clarity, while those who are more sensitive can feel steamrolled. But Matt also described the tender side of his dad, the man who holds hands with Barbara after decades of marriage, who can be heroic and inspiring when fights for what's right. One area where Ray had to draw on his own principles in a very personal way was with his son, Paul, who struggled with mental health, bipolar disorder. Ray and Barbara supported Paul through a tough battle. Paul eventually became a filmmaker and even made a feature film about bipolar disorder, which is called Touched with Fire. Ray opened up about that, saying how it was an ordeal, but taught him empathy and perspective. In a Facebook post, Ray actually said, as the father of a bipolar son who went through the terribly painful journey of saving him from self-destruction, I learned so much. This reveals a softer, fatherly Ray dealing with something no amount of money or analysis can solve, only love and perseverance. Tragically, the Dalios faced every parent's worst nightmare when in late 2020, their eldest son, Devin, died in a car accident at age 42. Devin's vehicle crashed into a store in Greenwich and caught on fire. It was an awful freak accident. Ray was heartbroken. He posted a public note calling the loss a devastating blow and described it like a bomb went off inside me. The outpouring of support from the community and colleague was immense. Devin had been a co-founder of a private equity firm and was loved by a lot of people. Ray said that tragedy showed him the importance of community and family love above all, and he expressed deep gratitude for the time they had with Devin. This event certainly added an element of human vulnerability to a man who often seen as an ultra-rational person. No principal can fully address such grief. I mean, just think about it. But Ray did reflect that it made him want to help others who face pain and to cherish people more. And on a lighter note, Ray Dalio has substantial interests outside of pure finance. When it comes to philanthropy, over the years, Ray and Barbara have become major philanthropists. The Dalio Foundation has donated over $1 billion to causes including education, microfinance, ocean exploration, and public health. In 2019, the Dalios pledged $100 million to improve public schools in Connecticut. They also teamed up with Michael Bloomberg to commit $185 million to marine conservation. Ray often says his goal is to give back more than half of his wealth in his lifetime. That's a lot of money. Ray loves the ocean. He funded OceanX, an initiative with fancy exploration ships and submarines to advance ocean science. His research yacht, the Alucia, even helped film a giant squid for the first time on the Discovery Channel. I mean, how cool is that? Ray finds the ocean similar to meditation, vast, deep, and humbling. When it comes to music, Ray loves music. He helped sponsor the Greenwich Town Party, which is an annual music festival, even getting rock legends to perform there. But Ray did have a pretty peculiar mini controversy when some media misconstrued him saying at a conference that the U.S. might become like China in handling wealth gaps. It was more of a sensational headline. Ray's actual point was about policy, effectiveness, not endorsing authoritarianism. Still, it shows how, as a public figure, he's sometimes misinterpreted. He tries to stay above the fray, often releasing long leaked-in posts to clarify his views whenever a soundbite stirs drama. And of course, Ray continues to meditate daily, a practice he's done for almost 50 years now. He often credits meditation for giving him equanimity and creativity. He's even funded bringing meditation programs to schools and veterans. Now in his mid-70s, Ray Dalio stands at an interesting juncture. He's no longer running a fun day-to-day, and he's busier than ever writing, researching, and meeting with global leaders. Yes, he's often converses with central bankers, presidents, and even Chinese Communist Party officials, sharing his perspective. I mean, I've seen him in videos with Kendra Lamar, and I love what he's doing on social media. He's like a wise uncle figure on the economic stage. TechCrunch once called him the wise uncle you wish you had because he distills big concepts into digestible principles. Ray's also very active on social media. Surprisingly, his LinkedIn and Twitter, which is now X, share everything from his study of history charts to his life advice. He embraces that role of educator. What can modern fund managers and really any ambitious professional learn from Ray Dalio's journey? And I think about that as a fund manager myself. His story is rich with lessons, but let's distill a few takeaways from this. 1, learn from failures and be humble. Dalio's greatest teacher was failure. Hitting a rock bottom in 1982 taught him to always question himself. As Ray put it, I learned to instead ask, how do I know I'm right? And to find people who disagree to stress test my views. The humility to embrace mistakes rather than hide them is rare in finance, an industry full of egos, but it's been a cornerstone of Bridgewater's sustained success. Dalio likes to say, if you're too proud to admit mistakes, you'll keep making them. 2nd, principles and process over predictions. Ironically, for a framed macro guru, Dalio's advice is not to rely on one's ability to predict, but rather to create a repeatable process that doesn't depend on being right all the time. He systematized investing rules so that Bridgewater wouldn't be at the mercy of any one call. This is a very relevant lesson. Build a strategy that can weather different storms. As fund managers, having a clear investment philosophy and risk management process or your own principles can keep you steady when the world gets crazy. 3rd, diversification and risk management. Dalio's holy grail of investing is famous. Combining 15 or more uncorrelated bets, and you can dramatically reduce your risk without reducing returns. This concept of risk parity and balanced beta versus alpha is now standard in many portfolios. Bridgewater's all-weather fund pioneered the risk parity approach of balancing asset classes that no single economic scenario wrecks the portfolio. Fund managers should remember, often the big blowups come from concentrated bets and hidden correlations. Ray's story literally went from near bankruptcy to billionaire by switching from concentrated to diversified thinking. 4th, radical transparency and team debate. While Bridgewater's exact methods might not fit everywhere, where few firms will tape every meeting or have employees rate each other with iPads in real time, the spirit of Dalio's culture can be applied universally. Encourage open dialogue, allow people to challenge the boss, and ground decision in logic and evidence. A modern fund manager leading a team can ask, do my analysis and people on my team feel safe to tell me when they think I'm wrong? Do we have a culture where truth is valued over politics? At Bridgewater, a 24-year-old can critique a CEO if they have data or reasoning. That's something many organizations could use more of. Maybe without the public hangings for mistakes. 5, study history and first principles. Dalio's edge often came from looking to history for lessons. He treated economics not as random, but as cycles and cause and effect relationships that repeat over centuries. For fund managers, the lesson is to broaden your perspective. If you think this time is different, check if maybe 50, 100, or 500 years ago, something similar happened. Whether it's inflation, debt defaults, or technical disruption, history offers clues. Dalio's approach of breaking things down to fundamental drivers, like his economic machine's three main forces, productivity, short-term debt cycle, long-term debt cycle, is a reminder to focus on fundamentals and not get lost in day-to-day noise. Number 6, balance conviction with open-mindedness. Ray is a great example of a strong view, weakly held mindset. He has strong convictions. He's not shy to say cash is trash or make bold calls, but he's willing to pivot when evidence changes or someone persuades him otherwise is key. That balance is gold for an investor. You need conviction to act on non-consensus ideas, but you also need the humility to change your mind. Dalio often says, hold opinions, but don't own them. Man, that is so good. He treats ideas as hypotheses to be tested, not precious treasures. Number 7, think in systems and second-order effects. Throughout his career, Dalio excelled by thinking systematically. For instance, seeing how a Mexico default can cascade into U.S. bank losses, but then how the Fed's reaction can reverse the cycle. For fund managers, this is a cue to always ask, and then what? What are the feedback loops? If interest rates spike, and what happens to stocks, to currencies, to economies, and then back to rates? Develop a worldview that connects the dots. Number 8, succession and letting go. On a management note, Dalio's story is a case study in how hard it is for founders to transition out. He tried to plan carefully. It took him 12 years to fully hand over control and put structures in place so Bridgewater wasn't just about him. He says he measures success now by seeing Bridgewater continue to do well without him. For any fund founder or business leader, planning your own exit is crucial. Building a team and culture and systems and processes that can cultivate without you is key. Ray's principle here might be no one is irreplaceable if you systematize your principles. Number 9, lifelong learning and evolution. Even in his 70s, Ray is like a student, reading, writing, learning new things. He never stopped being curious. In finance, where conditions change and new generations bring new ideas, that adaptability is key. Dalio shifted from commodities to global macro to risk parity to big data-driven decision tools, always evolving. He famously said, if you don't look back at yourself 1 to 2 years ago and think you were naive, you haven't learned much. Keep learning or you'll stagnate. Number 10, values and purpose. Finally, Dalio's journey underscores having a strong set of values. Whether one agrees with Bridgewater's values or not, they are clearly articulated and lived, internally at least. Ray's pursuit wasn't just money, it was an almost spiritual quest for truth and excellence, and later, a desire to help others through sharing the principles and philanthropy. For longevity in any career, having that deeper purpose can be a stabilizer. Ray faced personal and professional trials that money alone wouldn't see one through. It was his passion for the game and the mission that kept him going. As we wrap this up, it's worth marveling at the scale of Ray Dalio's impact. He turned Bridgewater into a behemoth that by 2020 had made clients $58.5 billion in net gains since inception, more than any other hedge fund ever. He influenced how institutions approach diversification and risk, popularizing risk parity and global macro diversification. He arguably influenced policy. His writings on deleveraging were read by central bankers during the Great Recession, and his voice on wealth, inequality, and reform, like his 2019 essay, Why and How Capitalism Needs to Be Reformed, added to that discourse. And through his books and media, he's influenced countless individuals who may never invest with Bridgewater but apply principles in their companies or lives. Yet Dalio's legacy is not without controversy. The book The Fund by Rob Copeland shines a less flattering light, painting Ray as obsessive, sometimes not practicing the very egolessness he preaches. According to Copeland, when confronted with criticism, Dalio can be defensive and controlling. He allegedly even tried to pay former staff not to speak to Copeland and threatened to sue the publisher for billions. Dalio dismissed the book as sensationalistic and inaccurate, basically a tabloid fodder. He wrote in LinkedIn, "It's another one of those distorted stories about me and Bridgewater. It won't matter to people who know us." The truth is likely somewhere between Dalio's self-portrayal and Copeland's critique. Dalio is human, intense, driven, with an ego that he has tried to harness and minimize, but with an ego nonetheless. It's hard to achieve what he did without some sort of ego. The contrast between how he sees himself, a humble truth seeker, and how detractors see him, a cultist micromanager, is a reminder that every strength can be a weakness in another light. Radical transparency yielded innovation and a bit of tyranny at once. For aspiring fund managers, Ray Dalio's story is a monument to what is possible and a cautionary tale rolled in one. It shows that with enough determination, one can come back from disaster stronger. I mean, few have come back as grand as Dalio after 1982. It also shows that building an organization in one's own image can create something unique and powerful, though it may invite misunderstanding and criticism from the outside. Now, here's my take. As a fund manager and educator myself, I find Dalio's integration of philosophy and finance super inspiring. He doesn't separate making money from finding meaning. In Ray's world, running a hedge fund was as much an intellectual and moral quest as it was a business. He sought to uncover timeless principles of markets and human nature. Not every fund manager needs to write a manifesto, but thinking deeply about why you do what you do and what values you'll hold yourself to is immensely valuable. It certainly has been for me, and Ray's example makes me want to articulate my own principles over the years. So when I face a daunting market like I've recently gone through or a tough call, I sometimes channel a bit of Ray's mindset. Be a hyper-realistic. See the world as it is, warts and all. Stay audacious. Don't fear big, unconventional bets if you've done the analysis. But double check my arrogance at the door. And invite the people I work with, my partners who disagree, to tell me why I might be wrong. And if it all goes south, treat that failure as just another puzzle piece in the journey moving forward. Ray Dalio's journey isn't over. He's now devoting his energies to philanthropy and passing on wisdom, and who knows, maybe he'll dive back in if a truly historic market event beckons. Once a trader, always a trader at heart, right? But his active legacy is now in the hands of the next generation at Bridgewater and in the minds of all who've read his work. To conclude, I leave you with a Ray Dalio quote that encapsulates a core theme of his life. Nature is a lot smarter than I am, and it made the laws. I learned through my mistakes. Honoring reality or nature is rewarding. Pain is nature's reminder of what we did wrong. If you handle it well, reflect on it, learn from it, and then push forward, you will grow. From a golf course caddy hearing stock tips to a global macro mastermind advising nations, Ray Dalio's story is one of constant evolution, guided by principles that he forged in both triumph and defeat. It reminds us that success in investing, as in life, comes not just from being right, but from how you deal with being wrong. And perhaps that's the most important principle of all. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fund Founders on the Funds on Fire podcast. This was a deep dive into the story of Ray Dalio. I hope his story sparked some insights for you. I know researching has inspired me further. So if you like this, please share it and check out the other episodes in the Fund Founders series that are to come. And so until next time, I'm Devin Robinson, encouraging you to stay curious, stay principled, and to keep learning from every step of your own journey to great success and greater impact. Peace.